Hello, and welcome to the second episode of the Camera Rolling podcast. I'm your host, Ronnie, and today we're going to be talking about two movies that I find pretty interesting. Depending on what circles you're in or the kind of movies you like, maybe even your age, you may or may not know one or both of these movies. Likewise, there are a few memes that circulated a few years ago about Debbie Ryan in Radio Rebel, and that was part of what inspired me to write about this movie and the other movie I'm going to talk about. Today, I want to talk about the first Radio Rebel, the movie that preceded Radio Rebel by 2-3 decades, and stars one of 80's hottest heartthrobs, Christian Slater. The movie I'm talking about is Pump Up the Volume, starring Christian Slater. But before we begin, I want to talk about a few movies that I watched recently because I like to do that at the beginning of the episodes. Firstly, I finally got around to watching the first two Saw movies, which are not for the weak of heart. Like, my stomach is kind of churning just thinking about them. The Saw movies are a horror, gore, mystery type of movie. Essentially, people get kidnapped and have to fight for their life to escape these traps that the creator Saw has put in front of them. And to be honest, I didn't really like them. I watched the first one and was kind of disturbed, but I decided to watch the second one because I had heard so much about the second one. And I really don't like movies like this as much as I like horror games or even horror in gores. But yeah, something about the senseless nature of it was really off-putting to me, and yeah, it just made me uncomfortable and kind of grossed out. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Again, this is another movie I've heard a lot about, and I've had a lot of people recommend me watch, but it was on the other day, and I was like, oh yeah, I haven't watched this movie yet. I loved the style and the editing, like most people had pointed out to me, but the story was kind of lost on me, to be honest. Maybe I've just known too many guys like Scott, and yeah, I just wasn't a huge fan of his character, or I don't know, maybe that's the point. I'm not sure, but it was definitely a good watch. Alright, so let's get into Radio Rebel and Pump Up the Volume. So the funny thing that sticks out between these two movies is that they're for very different demographics, and yet I was able to find both of them to have a lot of similarities. Needless to say, I don't think either movie has the intention of meeting the same audience. While Radio Rebel is more angled towards young teens who watch wholesome content like on Disney Channel, Pump Up the Volume is angled more towards older teenagers from the 80s and 90s who like Christian Slater and edgy themes. Anyway, let's talk about the plot of each of the movies in case you aren't sure what they are. Starting with Pump Up the Volume, the film was released in 1990 and directed by Alan Moyle. The story follows Christian Slater as Mark, an angsty teenager at a new school, and while he's shy at school, in the evening he does a pirate radio show as Happy Harry Hardon. He talks about being a teenager and the feelings that go along with that. However, when a kid from his school is found after calling into his show, everyone begins to realize the impact his words actually have. But he continues to go on air speaking up more and more with the intention of having people take action and make change. Then the school and the FCC get involved to stop him from broadcasting, and a girl at school finds out about his identity and wants to help/date him. And spoiler, he ends up getting arrested in the end, but he knows that he's changed the lives of the students at his school. Radio Rebel also follows a very similar plotline in that it's also about a teenager with a radio show. The movie was released in 2012 and directed by Peter Howitt, but it's actually based on the book Shrinking Violet by Danielle Joseph, which I'll talk about more throughout this video. But it's about Debbie Ryan as Tara, a shy girl who does a radio show in her free time. And when she gets a show on a major radio station, she begins speaking more directly about issues she has with her school. Students start to listen to her advice to dance and just be themselves. And of course, this irritates the principal, and the principal decides to cancel prom. So Tara is determined to make prom happen, even with the mean girl Stacy right on her tail. And in the end, she wins prom queen, gets the guy, and doesn't actually suffer any consequences. When hearing about the movies side by side, you can see how I came to the conclusion that these two movies needed to be talked about in the same setting. You can imagine my reaction when watching something like Pump Up the Volume or Radio Rebel and being like, wow, these are the same movie, just in very different fonts. They have very similar plots and a hobby that you don't often see in teen movies. Most teens have hobbies like sports or instruments or shopping or just hanging out with friends, but you don't often see radio DJ as a common hobby. However, in today's world, it's actually quite accessible, similar to the way podcasts are accessible. However, there are a few differences that stand out to me besides just the language that they use and the time period. One thing in particular that I noticed was the difference between the shows themselves. In Pump Up the Volume, Mark's character tended to have more of a podcast feel. He'd consistently talk about his feelings and invite others to share and then play a song. It seemed like he did a lot more talking, giving advice, and just having more of a conversation.
Yeah, I can smell it. I can almost taste it, the rankness in the air. It's everywhere. It's running through that old pipeline out there, trickling along that dumb concrete river and coming up through the drains of those lovely tract homes we all live in.
However, in Radio Rebel, Tara would often just say like a few lines about, I hate when the school takes my headphones, like we should all just dance to music however we feel like, and then she would play a song more like a DJ would, where she would play a lot more music during the show.
If you don't go to Lincoln Bay High, you missed out on a rock star day. I've never seen so many people dancing. So my listeners at Hoover High were so inspired by what went down at Lincoln Bay, they had a full-on flash mob at lunch today.
And in the book, the main character named Teresa also does the same. She's more of a DJ than a narrator. I actually found what I read of the book to be super interesting and different from the movie. The book has a lot more nuance and adult themes. Tara talks about her body image issues because she actually used to be more heavyset and had lost a little bit of weight, but most of that had set in because her mom is extremely vapid and appearance obsessed, which kind of partially comes through in the movie, but not to the extent like in the book. In the book, she also curses and talks about men she's interested in or finds attractive, and she talks about it pretty openly with her friend Audrey. In the book, Teresa seems more like a person with an alter ego to escape her family, rather than a girl who needs to escape herself the way it feels in Radio Rebel, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. So one of the most apparent themes between these two movies and the book is mental illness. So both films touch on themes I feel are pretty specific to the teenage experience, in that when you're a teenager, it's probably one of the first times you've actually encountered these types of experiences. One of the main experiences I'm talking about is that both of the main characters deal with anxiety and social anxiety. They both don't really engage with people they don't know well, especially at school. Mark is new at school, so it makes sense why he might not have any friends yet, but the scenes of him at school show that he doesn't really make an effort to make friends, and his dad even mentions it at one point. He's not involved with clubs, he eats by himself, and he doesn't like to speak up during class.
Mark, I was hoping that you'd share your feelings about it.
Similarly, Tara doesn't speak up or talk to many people if she can help it. And to be honest, after watching the movie, knowing what I know now about mental illness and anxiety, her portrayal was a lot more concerning than Mark's. Mark can be a bit crude and irrational on his show and just in general, but he seemed somewhat content with his loneliness and didn't hide when people did try to talk to him. It seems more like he just lacks confidence when it comes to social situations, whereas Tara physically hides from people who confront her. One scene that struck me as odd was when Tara hides behind a fridge when Cammy speaks to her in the break room for the first time. And hey, I'm someone who understands anxiety when they meet new people or have to interact with someone that they're not close to, but I don't feel so threatened that I feel the need to physically hide or remove myself. Tara almost always seems so scared that she leaves the room so she can't be seen. It honestly seems like she has some sort of trauma given how extreme her reactions are. For those watching on YouTube, I just had to do a little reset for a sec. Anyway, I'm not going to sit here and try and diagnose a fictional character because that's not my job or my expertise. But I will say, as someone who suffers from mental illness and anxiety, I have never gone to class, seen my crush, and then left class just so they wouldn't see me, just so they wouldn't know that I, in fact, do exist and can be perceived. Similarly, I've never had someone start talking directly to me and then hide in the same room as that person. And again, I don't say these things to try to diagnose or to shame anyone for doing these types of things, because I know everyone handles anxiety differently, but it just seems like such a large reaction to something that occurs fairly often. I also like to bring up this scene because Cammy's actually the first person in the film to actually try to help Tara through her anxiety. Though Tara's friend Audrey tries to help her and seems supportive, a lot of the time she just tells Tara to talk, which really isn't helpful advice. However, in that scene with Cammy, when Cammy realizes where Tara is, she tells her to take some deep breath and just to say what's on her mind. She does something similar when she shows Tara the booth she'll be using for her show. Tara begins to doubt herself and Cammy tries to give her advice. On the other hand, Pump Up the Volume talks directly about depression and anxiety. The first line of the movie is literally, "Do you ever get the feeling everything in America is completely effed?" Mark talks in many of his shows about feeling that nothing is worth doing, that most of the time, high schoolers are just doing what people tell them to do. It's through this that he inspires students to let go of their meaningless awards and achievements and not feel shame over the things people often make them feel shame for.
I don't mind being dejected and rejected, but I'm not gonna be ashamed about it.
Hallelujah.
At least pain is real. You look around and you see nothing is real, but at least pain is real.
There's also just a lot of great quotes in this movie, and I think this one speaks to the way a lot of people feel even into adulthood. I know I feel this way sometimes. I don't really find it exactly cheerful to be living in the middle of a totally exhausted decade where there's nothing to look forward to and no one to look up to. I bring up quotes like this because they emphasize the way mental illness, specifically depression, is something a lot of high schoolers identify with. And it can be made worse when they realize the kind of world that we live in and the world that they're about to enter. And for a lot of high schoolers, it's the first time that they're actually facing this kind of emotion. It's the first time they're identifying with a mental illness. However, I think in both movies they try to handle this subject by not giving a solution, but by imploring the students to embrace themselves in a reality that may not embrace them back. In Pump Up the Volume, he does a show about how the answer is not to take their lives, but to do something crazy or something they've always wanted to do. And that's what most of his listeners do. Similarly, Radio Rebel inspires them to embrace their quirks and to be confident in their identity. And in the end, the students rally together because they're stronger together. They make change as a group. Another aspect I found interesting between the two movies was the parasocial relationships that are created between the main love interest and the main character. A parasocial relationship is generally when a person experiences a one-sided relationship with someone who usually doesn't know they exist, and the person only encounters them in a non-personal way, such as through social media, TV, etc. And in these cases, their love interest is interested in the persona they put forward on the radio shows. I personally have just been thinking a lot about parasocial relationships recently, so it was interesting to rewatch both of these movies and find that that was a subject that came up in both of them but was just never addressed. In Pump Up the Volume, Nora listens to every show. She writes down notes that help her to try to uncover like the true identity of Harry. She sends these sensual love notes to his P.O. box and actively looks for him at school. But when she finally confronts Mark about it, when she figures it out, he completely dismisses her. He tries to get her to leave her alone, and she just seems taken aback by him. He's actually this shy and aloof type of guy instead of boisterous and sexy like he is on his show. Many of her letters allude to things that he's never done. And later in the film, when things kind of heat up between them, it becomes awkward when he wants to hit the brakes. Because in reality, he's inexperienced and nervous, but her character just gets annoyed with him. She doesn't push him to, like, go forward with it, but it's definitely weird that she expected so much more from him. She honestly just seems like she's disappointed that he's not actually hard Harry. In many ways, this isn't a surprise because it's kind of the nature of what a parasocial relationship is. I think a lot of people have found that their idols or celebrities are not all who they pictured them to be. I mean, there's probably 100 movies where teen girls meet their celebrity crush and he's actually just a normal guy, but they're almost never disappointed. They're just surprised, which I feel like in reality a lot of people are actually more disappointed by those types of things. I think this is really apparent on social media when we have people like the Kardashians that for a while consistently would sell us things and we didn't realize they were ads. Because when someone tells you about their favorite lip color, you take it as advice, but when a celebrity tries to sell you something, it's an ad and it feels really disingenuous. And that's what I think a parasocial relationship really does and creates, is this trust, and when you break it, it is very disappointing. In Radio Rebel, the love interest Gavin also listens to the show every day. And I think because her shows touch on what it's like to be shy and how to break away from that, he ends up regurgitating her message back to her. He ends up saying things that Radio Rebel has said, like line for line, back to Tara.
I try to remember I'm not as alone as I feel. Radio Rebel taught me that.
There are parts that read very much like the first episode of Hannah Montana, where Lily so badly wants to meet Hannah and realizes that it's actually just her best friend. And I appreciate that in Radio Rebel, Gavin actually knows who she is at one point and doesn't try to expose her. Though I don't really know what his motive would be to expose her. I don't know what he would really gain from that, so just makes sense that he wouldn't. But more or less, it does influence his desire and attraction to her later in the movie. But we don't really get to explore much of how that parasocial relationship affected their overall relationship once they were together in the end. And I didn't get a chance to read the whole book, but from the chapters that are freely available, it doesn't seem like Teresa actually talks that much on the show, which wouldn't, I think, allow for a lot of parasocial relationships to be created, or at least strong ones. The excerpts show that she just introduces the music, and maybe it changes later in the book, I don't know, but overall the same phenomenon happens. The contest becomes about getting a date with her alter ego, Sweet Tea, which, again, I think is so funny. Sweet Tea, like, That's so funny. And Gavin in the book seems more like someone who would listen to a show like Teresa's. He's not described as a popular kid the way Gavin is in Radio Rebel. It seems that Gavin in the book is more into alternative music and fashion and that kind of stuff. And again, I don't know if later he becomes popular in the book. I don't know if he also plays music and has a band, but it just seems like Gavin in the book doesn't have to make as far of a leap to like someone like Teresa because they're in similar circles and they're not like trying to jump like down from being popular to like wherever Tara is in the movie. I hope that made sense. Overall, I think parasocial relationships are kind of unavoidable, especially as a teenager, when you're consuming so much media these days. The idea that one can know someone else just from the information that is presented and not by meeting them isn't a new one. The way that teenage girls relate to media angled towards them a lot of times means creating this parasocial relationship to connect more deeply with the media or to help escape the everyday or even as a way to connect with others. As a former hardcore K-pop stan, I know that I met some of the coolest people and some of my best friends through our love for certain groups or just the music overall. In short, I think these movies are different in so many ways, but both have the same message. When you're a teenager especially, it's important to be true to yourself and not let others' expectations of you hold you back. While things may seem bleak at times, there's always time to change things. I think this quote from Pump Up the Volume speaks volumes, and it speaks to the hopeful message that sort of gets through all the depressing aspects of the movie. Feeling screwed up in a screwed up place, in a screwed up time, does not mean you're screwed up. I think we should always keep making movies that talk about these issues, whether it shows the heavy stuff or just lightly touches on it. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like Radio Rebel is a cinematic masterpiece because it's not. But if I was a kid growing up and I watched that, I would probably feel pretty inspired to be myself. Even as an adult, I am feeling inspired by Pump Up the Volume. And that's because it doesn't sugarcoat the truth. It just tells it like it is and still tries to at least give a hopeful message at the end. I implore all of you to actually go check out Pump Up the Volume. I was able to find a bootleg on YouTube in a bunch of little clips, but yeah, I think it's a really good movie and it's a really good watch. Either way, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I would definitely implore you to watch one or both of these movies because I think they're both pretty good, especially considering some of the topics that I covered today. I think you'll find that they're very apparent in both movies. I think being a teenager is both a really great time but also a really hard time, and I think both of these movies speak to that. But let me know any movies that you might like me to cover or talk about, because I really just pick up whatever thing interests me. Anyway, don't forget to follow and subscribe on YouTube, and with that, keep watching movies, and I'll see you next week.